Welcome back to the Normalize Breastfeeding podcast. I'm your host, Vanessa Simmons, and I'm excited to share with you our special guest feature for today. Before we get into it, I'd like for you to click that subscribe button below, share this video or podcast, and be sure to follow us on social media. All right, let's go. Welcome back. We are live with our guest, Zainab Yate. Zainab is the author of the resource site, breastfeedingaversion.com. She has been a breastfeeding peer supporter for the NHS for a number of years. She actively supports mothers and families who struggle with aversion and campaigns to raise awareness of the phenomenon. In her professional capacity, she is a biomedical ethicist, vice chair of a research ethics committee panel for the Health Research Authority, and a member of King's College London Ethics and Policy Governance Board. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for inviting me to talk about aversion.
Yes, we're happy to have you. This is the official Normalize Breastfeeding podcast, where we'll be discussing breastfeeding experiences, education, activism, advocacy, and all the things inside of the infant feeding community. So today we're recording live with Zainab Yate, live from the Boob Hive in London, all the way from the UK.
Freezing cold.
Wonderful. So this is episode 23, Breastfeeding Aversion and Symptoms of Agitation. If you're interested in being a featured guest or a sponsor, listen until the end for more information about how to get in touch. So let's get into it, Zainab. I have some pretty good questions for you today. So I'm interested to know, how did this particular topic under the umbrella of breastfeeding spark your passion?
Because I struggled with it myself, and I didn't understand why, and I couldn't find out why, and nobody answered my questions. They didn't really have the answers to why it was happening. So that's really where I am. Where I am now is because of that 6 years ago. Really, it started with my firstborn. And I had it also with my second. So when breastfeeding triggers emotions was something that just wasn't really spoken about or understood, and in many ways isn't now, but at least more people are aware of it. So it's I suppose you could call it a passion.
It's definitely
I actually stopped doing my I was actually passionate about my PhD and my ethics related research in my PhD, but I actually stopped that because of all of this. I started writing and researching about this more, and I withdrew from my PhD last year. So it's really funny you should say passion. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, I wonder, what did the term breastfeeding aversion, when did it come into play, like in existence among infant feeding professionals? I know you said that you struggled with it 6 years ago. Was that around the time that professionals started to recognize that this was something real?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it was known amongst the professionals in the infant feeding community in the sense that many people knew aversion could happen when you were tandem feeding, like when pregnant or feeding a toddler and a newborn. And in terms of the literature, there are literally a handful. So Hilary Flowers mentions breastfeeding agitation, and some people called it nursing aversion in her book, which was published by the La Leche League. So, the La Leche League community around the world, those of them who tandem fed would have known about it. And obviously they are mother supporters, but they're also breastfeeding counselors and IBCLCs and professionals in their own right across the world. So, yeah, I think they would have known about it in the infant feeding community, but certainly not medical doctors or health visitors like you have here in the UK, or midwives. It's not very well known. In fact, it didn't really get much attention, I suppose. Yeah, I'm not sure how much it's getting now, but
much more than the past. Much more than in the past, I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah.
At some point in time, people probably related it more to like postpartum depression or something along the lines of like, it's not the breastfeeding, it's something else, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Well, definitely. That's hopefully where I'm gonna try and go. Like some of it is directly related to breastfeeding.
Right.
Other times it's not. Other times it's a combination of both. But yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny you should say about postnatal depression, because it overlaps a lot with the negative feelings. Like anger and low mood and agitation that can be found in people with depression and also with postnatal depression. So it does overlap. But there are many women who have aversion and who aren't depressed. And so there's quite a few unanswered questions there. So yeah, that's why I published a paper about it 2 or 3 years ago. And I just described the phenomenon as a phenomenon because then it allowed scope to include things like this, like overlap with depression and possible causes to do with anatomy or biology or things like that.
Definitely. And you talked a little bit about, your PhD kind of leading into you campaigning for this specific cause and terminology. Were there any other reasons why you just kind of felt the need to start? Was there something specific that kind of pushed you over the edge and you just said, okay, I'm creating a social media platform for this because it's enough is enough,
Yeah, actually, because I tried to speak to some people in the field about it and it wasn't really acknowledged. Without anything published, it's not recognized. And I became a little bit disheartened and frustrated because, firstly, like I said, nobody was able to answer the questions I had about why I was feeling like this. But secondly, because other women I know had mentioned it, and it just felt like it was being shut down.
Right.
Wasn't acknowledged in terms of it existing in a sense. And then thirdly, because like you, I initially thought it would have been postnatal depression, but I reached out to my, what they call here, a GP, a local doctor, general practitioner,
Okay.
and I explained how I felt, and they assessed me, clinically assessed me for postnatal depression. There was screening and assessment, and I wasn't postnatally depressed. So
Right.
I was a bit, I was relieved, but at the same time, I still had more answers. And then I started supporting mothers with breastfeeding difficulties in general, just as a peer supporter. And even in the infant feeding community, it was very difficult to talk about it without being, I don't know how to say it diplomatically, maybe shut down.
Right.
So, we have one of the worst breastfeeding rates in the world. Actually, it's less than 1% exclusively breastfeed in this country. So looking back, I understand the position of infant feeding institutions that wanted to protect the positive and important aspects of breastfeeding. But it was just hard because, like many, many thousands of other women, we are breastfeeding mothers who experience aversion, if that makes sense. So we're breastfeeding mothers. We're not people who didn't try. We're not people who don't breastfeed. We're not people who don't don't want to breastfeed. We're people who are breastfeeding, who want to breastfeed, and who live by it.
Right.
So I think I got really, really annoyed, and then I just thought, oh, I don't have the time to do anything, and that's where I started doing online work, because it just felt like the natural step to raise awareness of it.
Well, and it seems like they were trying to protect the good of breastfeeding at the detriment of the people who they were trying to protect.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit strange, but yes, things like that happen here in the United States as well. However, we have seen a huge boom in breastfeeding over the last, I want to say, 10 to 15 years. And so, and especially since the 70s, like I think I can't remember the specific statistic, but I know that we have gone from, like, let's say 53% of exclusive breastfeeding to like 84% now, or something like that, something crazy like that.
Wow.
So definitely more campaigns happen in the UK for sure. For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm fully committed to that. I was fully part of that movement. As much as my energy could allow me. There's so many amazing women in this country who dedicate all their time and energy to improving breastfeeding rates. It's really they give their blood, sweat, and tears. I've seen it. I know that I worked with some amazing women who wrote the WBTI report, the World Breastfeeding Trends Initiative report in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was like a 3 or 4 year project, and they, launched it in Parliament, and they're striving to make strategies better to improve breastfeeding. So I understand, but then there needs to be a voice for the people who struggle as well and hate it and really can't stand breastfeeding and just.
Well, and I mean, if we talk about breastfeeding from a cultural perspective, like, it's not something that we grow up seeing be done. If we grow up seeing it be done around us and seeing the positives of it, even if there's some negatives, right? We have the opportunity to develop a perspective about it that is not just, I am this baby's slave. I am this baby's, milkmaid. I have to sit here every, 20 minutes and give the breast. I mean, that can be daunting to a culture that says that you can have someone else feed your baby whenever and that you can sleep whenever, right? So then when you kind of apply that cultural perspective, you kind of see that we've kind of raised young women to believe that it's not the norm, right? So then when they tell you to breastfeed, you're like, wait, what? I had no idea that was part of this plan, So I completely understand.
Completely. I've got a huge smile on my face because you just hit the nail on the head.
Oh, wonderful.
You hit the nail on the head. Yeah. It's not, it's not just in a silo, it's all the society around it, and essentially an expectation, and your expectations about what the journey will be like, and your expectations about what the experience will be like, and your expectations because of what you've been fed, telling you how easy breastfeeding is, because it's really, it's kind of idealized in all these imagery.
Yes.
And the reality of it, like the reality of anything, like the reality of marriage, or the reality of a promotion with the job position you always wanted, or the reality of almost anything is a lot more harder than you expect. But I just think it's not, we didn't have it in our education system. I never knew anything about lactation or breastfeeding until the day after my son was born, essentially.
Exactly.
It seems ridiculous. Exactly. Yeah, you should be told about it before.
Most definitely. In Australia, and just shout out to anybody who may be listening from Australia, you are in our prayers. We cannot believe how crazy these fires have been. But in Australia, I've heard that in the indigenous communities, the Aborigine communities, that they would give the young girls as young as 8 years old. And I mean, obviously, we've seen now on Instagram that they do it much younger, but they'll give them a doll, and the girls will pretend like they're nursing their babies. And this is just a simple way to impact and educate young girls who are growing up who will one day possibly have children. And if they do, they'll have this memory that was not negative, a memory that is their own, and a memory that they actually applied that holding of the baby to their breast. And so it kind of makes, it might go into their subconscious and maybe they'll forget about it by the time that they're older, but they might not shrug against it and say, oh, I don't know if I can do this, kind of changes their mentality from a very young age. So
yeah, it would be a very powerful inception.
very much.
It's known, it's been shown to work in other areas of healthcare and things like that. This kind of early on inception idea that it's part of normal life, in a sense.
Yes. And I think that we see it now we see it daily, really, on Instagram. You'll see, a woman who's been breastfeeding her baby and her older toddler now has their baby doll to their chest. Why? Because they see that that's how you feed a baby, and that is truly normalizing breastfeeding for the next generation, is really taking the time to just say, yeah, you can nurse your baby too. Oh, you want to feed your baby? And sometimes they'll hand the doll to the mom and say, well, you've got the milk, you feed the baby. But I mean, it's all a really great, opportunity to explore the idea at a much younger age. And I think it leaves people, because it's young girls and boys now that are doing this, it allows them to have, ideas that are more broad than what they would normally learn at that age, which is, the baby comes with a bottle. It's included. Most packaging has a bottle included, so yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, let's dive in really quickly. What are the symptoms of aversion? What can a mother know? Like, what can she say, okay, I have this, and this is pointing me toward I'm having symptoms of aversion?
Well, you've got some main ones would be the negative emotions like anger and agitation, irritation, and even rage when the baby or the child or the toddler is latched.
Right.
Very common to have skin itching or skin crawling sensations, like little ants or little creepy crawlies under your skin. And some intrusive thoughts around the same time being latched. Things like wanting an urge to delatch, an overwhelming urge to delatch your nursling and take them off, or to push them off you, or to run away, like literally just leave them. Doesn't matter if it's 3 a.m. or whatever. And generally tend to disappear once you delatch, or when the feeding finishes, the breastfeeding session ends. So those are the main ones. There's a spectrum, but those are the main ones, and it can cross over with dysphoric milk ejection reflex, and like you said, it could cross over with depression. But if you're generally okay in other parts of your life, and things are manageable, and you're not feeling very hopeless for long periods of time, but you get very, very irritated and angry when latching your nursling or your toddler, then that's going to be a primary symptom of aversion.
Right.
The fact that it happens when they're latched and goes away when they're not latched.
So are there any differences in symptoms of agitation? Do they vary from those of aversion, or is it kind of all in the same pot?
It's all in the same pot, really. It's so some women can differentiate between the kind of feelings of aversion that they get during their menses or when they ovulate, and the kind of symptoms they get when they've got a deadline for work tomorrow, or they've got a paper due, and they need to be working on their paper for school or something, but they're stuck doing a 3-hour boob to sleep. You can kind of tell the levels of irritation about being stuck in a room in the dark when you've got an impending deadline is a different thing to perhaps a biological cause for your aversion, which can be related to your hormones, like your menstruation or your ovulation.
Yeah.
But generally they can be the same. And that's because these kind of negative feelings, they're the end result of other things. Do you see what I mean? That's why it's quite similar. So the underlying reason could be different because we're all very different people with different sets of family circumstances and stresses on our lives.
Right.
But in the end, we're all human, and mothers who are exhausted or tired or pulled in 50 different directions, it's going to come out in a similar way.
Definitely.
Just on a survival mode, just being frustrated. Yeah.
Well, and I can relate to the PMS symptoms and how when I experienced aversion with my last child, it definitely felt very much like that. So that's very interesting that you say that. I want to know at what point in one's breastfeeding journey would a mother be most likely to experience aversion? Like, is this something that you guys have witnessed is happening with new mothers, like newborns? Or is this something that really happens when you get into like, toddler and child breastfeeding?
Well, traditionally it was considered to be only something that occurred, like I mentioned, in tandem feeding.
Okay.
And also there's a paper from years ago, I mean, maybe 30 odd years ago, that posited these kind of feelings could be a natural biological trigger to wean. So if we were going to consider it as that, then it would make no sense for a baby under 6 months or for a newborn to wean because, historically or in the sense of human existence, that would mean the death of the baby. Right. Moreover, so however, saying that, I have personally experienced it with what would be considered a very small baby, so 3 months, 3.5 months, and I'm not the only one. There's quite a few in the aversion support groups that experience it just with a newborn right from the get-go. And there are a few reasons for that, but in terms of numbers, it's really hard because there's no data. So I can't tell you of the prevalence of aversion amongst the breastfeeding population around the world. So I can't tell you out of 100,000 women, 500 would get aversion.
Right.
So out of those 500 that would get aversion, I can't tell you, 10 would get it with a newborn, but 90% will get it with older nurslings.
Right.
However, it seems to be a lot more prevalent in older nurslings. And again, I understand that from my research because the causation is different. So it's more likely with an older nursling for a lot more predominant reasons. Whereas with a newborn, I think there are very specific reasons a mother may get it. But I'm not a clinician, so I can't really state that yet. I mean, maybe when my book is published, I'll be more of an authority on it. But for example, a very clear indication would be a survivor of sexual abuse. So she's a survivor. Then they're well known to initiate breastfeeding and want to breastfeed, and often do actually establish a breastfeeding relationship. However, they also do struggle with being triggered.
Right.
So for me, at least from the mothers I've helped, I can see that relationship abuse, prior or existing, can be a factor in getting aversion with a newborn. Does that make sense? Right. So yeah, it happens. Yeah, it happens, basically.
Definitely. I have another question. This is my final question too. Where can where can mothers find support for these emotional mood swings? Obviously, we don't have any specific place other than your resource and your website. I don't know if you're taking personal clients, but who would you suggest that they speak to when they're feeling these types of emotions? Their primary care doctor, or like you said, their general physician? Is that the best resource for them? Or are you saying that there's like a Facebook group maybe that they can try and get more information about this?
Yeah, that's all of the above. I mean, I cover it a lot in my book because there are two really important things about going to healthcare professionals. The first is non-disclosure, and a lot of women don't disclose that they get these feelings, and I would urge you to disclose them. I have written quite a few posts on the resource website, which are, it's just free to print or read, which give you the words to describe what's happening to you. So it's not, when you have the words to describe what's happening to you, you can kind of say it in a non-alarmist way, if that makes sense.
Right.
So I urge you to disclose, ideally to someone who's trustworthy and supportive. So it could be a partner, although partners are not always helpful because they often think it's very odd for women to experience negative emotions when breastfeeding, but that's again because they've been kind of subjected to the same propaganda we have that breastfeeding is all butterflies and unicorns. But someone you trust, because secrecy never makes anything better.
Right.
And secondly, to healthcare professionals, the other thing is just misdiagnosis. So you don't want to disclose this and then get lumped into the category of postnatal depression without proper assessment, because if they give you SSRIs, these kind of antidepressants, and they don't work, then you're going to be back to square one, or possibly even worse off. So if you're not depressed and you're taking antidepressants, that's the problem. But definitely go to a healthcare professional to disclose it. If you can get to any kind of breastfeeding group, a lot of breastfeeding counselors and IBCLCs know about negative feelings being triggered by breastfeeding now, because we have DMER, we have dysphoric milk rejection reflex, and we've got aversion, and we also have things that we understand about different cohorts of women who struggle with breastfeeding. So they're the specialists if you can get in their lecture lead group on. But the easiest and quickest way is definitely a Facebook support group, or sharing and reading the online posts from women. We have a good community on Instagram who are really supportive and really vocal about their challenges with aversion. And there's a couple of nursing aversion support groups on Facebook. So, and they're really active. And in my one, I try and do lives just to answer questions, and I post about different literature I've read that might help. So sometimes just knowing what aversion is, knowing it has a name, knowing you're not the only one, knowing you're not a monster is enough. Yes. So yeah, all of the things you said, I think would be good to try.
Well, listen, I truly appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. I know you said you have an upcoming book. Do you want to plug your book? Is it already you've got a title and you're ready to announce? I'm hoping.
I have a title, but I have I have two offers and one waiting on one literary agent. So
wonderful.
I'm just torn between who to take. Yeah, so I mean, I'll sign a contract. I just have to choose which one's going to be best for the course.
Right.
So yeah, I'll let you know as soon as it's out. Yeah, so that's really good. I don't know what it's called yet.
That's okay. So let's shout out your social media. It's Breastfeeding Aversion on Instagram. Do you have a different name for your group on Facebook or for your Facebook page?
The Facebook page, I think it's Breastfeeding Aversion, and agitation awareness, but really anything with the hashtag aversion sucks. The group is joined to the page, so it's called Aversion Sucks.
Awesome.
But there are quite a few, nursing aversion groups. So really just find what works, and know that it won't last, and that you'll still find some peace in your relationship with your nursling after it leaves you. I just want to send a little bit of hope out there for moms that are struggling right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zainab. I appreciate it so much. And I hope
No
to have you on
worries.
the
Thank you for
podcast
giving the
again.
platform.
Of course. I hope to have you on
Thank
again after
you.
your book is released. We can talk to moms more about this and keep this conversation going. It's definitely one that that needs to be continued.
Oh, I really would appreciate that. Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.
A lot.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, my name is Vanessa Simmons, and I'm your host of the Normalize Breastfeeding podcast. We're looking forward to hearing your story and featuring you on this platform. Send us a message if you'd like to be featured, or email me directly at vanessa@normalizebreastfeeding.org.